Okay, I would like to start this session by thanking Nick for giving me the honor to chair this session, and I would also like especially to thank Nick for the Burtonian energy with which he is now, putting up this sixth session, and hopefully also we will have other Burton conferences for the greatest pleasure of Burton fans. So thank you, Mick. Our first speaker today is Joe Butler. He is a teacher in London, and he wrote a PhD on Burton entitled Sex, Race and Fieldwork, Richard Francis Burton, Locating a Figure in the History of Anthropology. So,
thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the title of this paper is Eminently Qualified with Peculiar Attainments, Richard Francis Burton in Somaliland, 1854-55. So I'll start off with a kind of a ripping yarn prologue. Between 2 and 3 in the morning of the 19th, I was aroused by the cry that the enemy was upon us. My first impulse was to request Lieutenant Hearn to go with his revolver in the direction of the attack. Secondly, I called to Lieutenant Stroyan and Speak that they must arm and be ready. And thirdly, I sent my servant for my sabre. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hearn returned hurriedly from the rear of the tent, exclaiming that our 12 servants, armed with swords and muskets, had run, and that the enemy amounted to about 150 men. Lieutenant Stroyan, who occupied another tent, did not appear. The other 2 officers and I were compelled to defend ourselves on our own with revolvers, which the darkness of the night rendered uncertain. Presently, our fire being exhausted and the enemy pressing on with spear and javelin, the position became untenable. The tent was nearly battered down by clubs, and had we been entangled in its folds, we would have been killed without the power of resistance. I gave the word for a rush and sallied out with my sabre, closely followed by Lieutenant Hearn and Lieutenant Speak in the rear. I was surrounded at the time by about a dozen of the enemy, whose clubs rattled on me without mercy, and the strokes of my sabre were rendered uncertain by the energetic pushes of an attendant who thus hoped to save me. The blaze was raised to cut him down. He cried out in dismay, and at that moment a Somali stepped forward, threw his spear so as to pierce my face, and retired before he could be punished. A few months earlier, the exploration of Somaliland had been proposed by the Royal Geographical Society to the East India Company as early as 1849. It had never gone beyond the planning stage until Burton had campaigned to undertake the expedition. The board of the directors of the East India Company gave its support to Burton, and on his qualifications to lead, the board of directors wrote, "Lieutenant Burton appears eminently qualified to conduct such an expedition, which requires not only peculiar attainments, but the combination of energy and perseverance with prudence and discretion." Furthermore, Burton's expedition was to be considered an unofficial one, undertaken by Lieutenant Burton as a private traveller, the government giving him no more protection to him than they would to any individual totally unconnected with the service. The only protection that the East India Company gave to the Somaliland expedition were guarantees of safe passage from Somali chiefs and the threat of a naval blockade to the Somali coast. So every assistance short of actual assistance. The expedition consisted of 4 British officers with Burton in command. Burton had initially divided the expedition up and given the different members separate missions. Speak was to explore a wadi and to purchase animals for the main part of the journey. Stroyan and Hearn were sent to the area around Berbera, which is in modern-day Somalia, a seasonal market town and trading port which was then uninhabited for most of the year. Burton undertook his personal mission to be the first European to enter the forbidden Muslim city of Harar in modern-day Ethiopia, some distance from Berbera inland. He succeeded and returned to Berbera to rejoin the rest of the expedition. Speak had had difficulties with his Somali Aban, who were kind of protectors or guides or chaperones for that region, who had swindled him and prevented him from carrying out his mission. At that point, the Somaliland expedition returned to Aden, where Burton had 2 of the Abans prosecuted before a British court. The expedition re-embarked to Somaliland and set up camp just outside Berbera. They had a number of locally recruited expedition members, and they were preparing to travel inland to explore, the interior of Somaliland, and in an attempt to locate the source of the White Nile. The annual trading fair was then on at Berbera, and the expedition hoped to travel on with a caravan going inland once the fair had broke up. Burton's actions against the Abans and his refusal to engage new ones alienated a local tribal group, the Habirawal. The Berber fair broke up, but the Somaliland expedition stayed on at the campsite. Burton later claimed that he was waiting for mail from Aden, or orders from Aden. The camp was attacked by the Somali tribesmen. Stroyan was speared and stoned to death. Speak was briefly taken captive, and both he and Burton were both badly wounded. After the attack, the British authorities at Aden immediately began a naval blockade of the Somali coast, and one Brigadier Coughlin, who was in command in Aden, initiated the inquiry into the attack, and he asked all of the expedition officers and members for their own reports. So the peculiar attainments, which seems like a kind of a backhanded compliment, there were a number of British officers who had demonstrated an interest in the people and languages of the regions they were serving in. Two such officers, R.L. Playfair and C.P. Rigby, could have been considered amateur anthropologists in their own right. Playfair was fluent in Arabic and was assistant political resident at Aden during the inquiry. In 1859, he published a book in which he criticised Burton for the lack of security measures at Berbera on the night of the attack. Rigby was, like Burton, successful at learning languages. He was fluent in Arabic and had written a grammar of the Somali language that Burton had used in his preparations for his expedition. Rigby and Burton were firm enemies. Rigby later sided with Speak in his dispute with Burton, and both Playfair and Rigby had successful official careers and were highly respected in their own community. It is difficult, however, to imagine either of them embarking on the expeditions and journeys into uncharted territories that Burton did. They had an intellectual interest in the places they were stationed in, but stayed within the boundaries of acceptable behaviour and good taste. Burton tended to transgress boundaries of good taste in his investigations. There was no telling what information he might come back with. In Somaliland, he reported on the widespread Somali use of the narcotic known as cat. Burton used the drug himself so he could assess its potency. It was during his time in Somaliland that he later claimed to have measured a man's penis and researched Somali sexual activity. As for his own sexual practices, Burton obliquely informed his readers that he had contracted syphilis. He wrote, "I was now haunted by the dread of a certain complaint for which sulphur is said to be a specific." At the beginning of the expedition, Burton assumed a disguise, as he had done for the pilgrimage to Mecca. However, the Somalis knew from the very beginning that he was a British Army officer. They were suspicious of the British and believed correctly that they intended to move against the slave trade in their country. In Zayla, he was under the city governor Sharmakay's protection. Outside of Zayla, there were many local tribal groups who were in conflict with Sharmakay. Burton left Zayla and travelled with a party of servants and bodyguards inland towards the city of Harar. At virtually the last moment, outside the walls of Harar, he abandoned his disguise and entered the city as an Englishman. Burton claimed to be the first European to gain entry to this forbidden Muslim city and to live to tell the tale. He wrote, "I was under the roof of a bigoted prince whose least word was death. Amongst the people who detest foreigners, the only European that had ever passed over their inhospitable threshold, and a fated instrument of their downfall." Didn't quite work out like that, though. The danger to his life in Harar had been quite real. Three men of the Habarawal tribe, the group later responsible for the attack on the Somaliland expedition, had been in the city and had been intriguing against Burton. They'd been warning the Emir about him. James Clifford, an anthropologist, wrote an essay called Travelling Cultures, and he says the ethnographic subjects are never static. They're not just waiting around to be discovered or studied. They travel around, they're interested, they have opinions. For Burton, they were just the silent subjects of his research, but far from being passive figures, they were looking at the British officers and learning as much as they could about them. The Somalis effectively controlled the expedition through their system of Abans. Their intelligence system crossed tribal boundaries and surrounded the expedition members. They knew exactly where each of the officers from the expedition were at any one time. The Somalis Burton met on his journey to Harar knew of current affairs such as the Crimean War and of recent storm damage to the harbour in Bombay. In Harar, Burton heard that his brothers, Speak, Stroyan and Hearn, were camped at Berbera. So that word had reached Harare. Frank McLean wrote in his book about exploration that 2 things made it possible for the Europeans to open up Africa: quinine to counter malaria, and modern weapons such as breech-loading and magazine rifles and machine guns to counter Africans who might object to intruders. And the Somaliland expedition occurred before these developments and at an earlier stage in European exploration. It simply did not have the military hardware to force its way through the country. The Somaliland expeditions members were armed with Colt and Adams revolvers, but they were the early cap and ball models, which were slow to reload and unreliable. On the night of the attack, Hearn and Burton, and that's it, Burton even had a revolver. Now I'm reading it, it's not quite clear that he had anything other than his sabre. They quickly exhausted their ammunition and had no time to reload. Hearn says he couldn't see to reload. And like down a rabbit hole on the internet shows you need a flat surface, it's very time consuming, you're reloading each chamber, there's just not time to reload these weapons. That's it, they fire. Speake was captured because his Adams revolver jammed and wouldn't fire. And that led him, they overpowered him and caught him. The dramatic moments of the attack at Berbera at the beginning of this chapter can be read as an expulsion story, an alternative to the traditional insertion story common to ethnographies. If any of you have ever read anthropology, it's an insertion story where the anthropologist gets, put in among the people. So Malinowski with the Trobriand Islanders. Burton's tent, he keeps talking about, was a sepoy rotai. The tent has an important place in the history of ethnographic fieldwork. George Stocking has described the ethnographer's tent as a fragile canvas artifact of civilized Europe, the place where Malinowski retreated to escape the Trobriand Islanders. Rosaldo writes of Evans Pritchard's use of his tent during his fieldwork with the Noor in the Sudan in the 1930s, that it somehow resembled Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, an instrument of surveillance and power. Burton nearly died in his tent. As if to refute his ethnography, he was almost killed by a lance thrown by a Somali warrior. He had been dismissive of both the type of weapon and the fighting qualities of the Somalis in his book as being far too primitive. And then we go to the official report. The very first paragraph in Coughlin's inquiry report refers to the mail for the expedition having been dispatched on time. It's not our fault. So almost immediately it looks as if maybe Burton unwittingly put Coughlin on alert, and this is standard bureaucracy, these people don't take the blame, and the easiest thing is let's put the blame on Burton, and then he starts piling it on. Coughlin was unhappy with the conduct of the officers and seemed to form the opinion quite quickly that the main blame lay with Burton. All 4 officers were asleep. There were only 2 sentries posted. They were all asked how much ammunition you had. But again, the guys ran away. It didn't matter how well trained they were, and even if the British officers had been there, they just ran away. And these were not Somali police officers, they were just ordinary members of the expedition. The Somalis themselves did not take the blockade lying down. The elders of a subgroup of the Havira Wall drafted a letter to Coughlin in which they appealed against the blockade. Again, James Clifford, these people are, they have agency, they're going to talk to the people in Aden. The elders wrote that their particular group were innocent of the attack and were being unfairly punished. They claimed that the officers of the Somaliland expedition had been warned of the attack and they had brought it upon themselves because they covet the country. They travelled to Aden and had a meeting with Coughlin. The letter and the deputation from the Havira Wall appeared to have made an impression on Coughlin. The tone of his reports began to swing even more against Burton and in sympathy with the Somalis, that they were the victims. He felt that the members of the expedition had been too relaxed with security to the point of negligence. They had incited the Somalis by challenging the custom of abanship, and Burton's alliance with Sharmakeh had earned him the suspicions of the Somalis, who believed he was going to establish a base at Berbera and starts trying to suppress the slave trade. Coughlin started to suggest a date for removal of the blockade. And eventually, I was reading the original file. Mary Lovell refers to a file in the India Office records, and it goes on for weeks and months, and you can see all these letters taken. And I can remember reading Coughlin's report going, he's taking the side of the Somalis. This is Britain, the British Empire. They're not going to let him away with this. And eventually, he gets a letter telling him to stop right there. He's a British officer, we're not taking their side. Eventually, they step in and check him and stop him. In Burton's defence, there's a lot of hindsight bias here on the part of Coughlin, and not a little hypocrisy. The board of directors to the East India Company had been satisfied with the progress of the Somaliland expedition after the initial expeditions, after the first legs, and had given its permission for it to proceed to the second phase. The East India Company was even considering the possibility of establishing a British agency at Berbera, which Burton had recommended. Sharma was a British ally. The British at Aden had introduced Burton to him. So now he's been punished. How dare you operate with Sharma? Well, he was their ally in Somaliland. And again, they had first loaned Somali officers. They didn't give any of the locally trained Somali British soldiers or police officers to the expedition, so no help was given to them at all. Burton and Speke had been invited back to Britain, so Burton wasn't even there to dispute these claims. And it was years before he realised that he had been held largely responsible for the attack itself. He went on to the Crimean War, and then afterwards onto the second expedition. And consequently, the Somaliland expedition members would not be compensated. Burton regarded the inquiry as a betrayal, and for years afterwards, critical references to Cochrane, Playfair, and the East India Company would appear in his work. He never forgot it. So in conclusion, the Somaliland demonstrated that British imperial expansion in the 19th century was not a foregone conclusion. It represents a failure on Burton's part, perhaps as an ethnographer, in that he didn't even foresee the possibility of the Somali attack. And the ethnographic subject, the Somalis, wounded and nearly killed him. And he narrowly has avoided being made the official scapegoat of the disastrous end to the expedition by the British authorities at Aden. And Burton is caught, and even though in all of his books and articles he's the expert, he's the master of all his surveys, he was actually quite naive sometimes with this. He didn't play the game in terms of dealing with people in power. He was caught like a pawn in a geopolitical game between the British and the Somali tribes. Both of them were concerned with the slave trade for different reasons. Both sides gathered intelligence on the other, and the strike against the Somaliland expedition was a calculated move against British intrusion in the area, and as such it was successful. The British did not return until the late 19th century. And as for Burton, it gave him one of his best books, lots of anecdotes, but apart from acquiring a new set of lifelong enemies amongst his own people, it is not clear that he really learned much from the experience. He didn't really understand what led the Somali attack. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. So would you like to ask questions? Are there questions for Joe?
Yeah. Sorry. You mentioned when you were rereading the sources, you weren't even sure that he had a revolver with him. Mm-hmm. Does he mention carrying firearms of other kinds? Were you making a distinction, between a revolver and something else, or just that he was armed with a sword?
I'd have to go back. He mentions the saber again. When he goes to America, he mentions getting kitted out with a pair of revolvers and arriving. He gives all the equipment, but then he never speaks of them again. Okay. So even if he had one, you fire 6 if they fire, then you can't reload.
They're not exactly a well-armed expedition.
Yeah, so they wouldn't have. And they had, the only way around it was like like Jesse James and all those outlaws used to carry lots of revolvers. You wouldn't, if you ever watch it, you have to literally load each chamber. It's tiny. You wouldn't do it, and under the stress of an attack like that.
I've always wondered how they managed to get away from 150 people like that.
Again, it's a good question.
A gun that, if they had a machine gun or something, you'd understand, but a gun that won't fire, you have to, And then one of them died too, right? One of them was...
Stroy never, he was killed in his tent. Speaking, Burton probably should have died.
Yeah.
They came very close.
Somaliland,